Mother convinced she found missing son, but people noticed something's off. Nothing is more important to a mother than their child, and they will go through anything to ensure their safety and health. For this reason, one can imagine the sheer horror and pain a mother feels when their child goes missing, and the desperation which would leave them clinging to the hope of their safe return. However, one mother's hope was soon distorted when her child returned to her, but he wasn't at all how she remembered him, and you'd be surprised how far some people go for fame. Roger Tichborne was young, educated, and rich, so it was no surprise when he decided to travel the world in 1854. His family saw him off with great farewells, but it wasn't even 4 days later that a man walking along the coast came across the wreckage of Roger's ship, the Bella. It was clear that Roger had been unable to fulfill his dream. With the wreckage being found scattered across the Brazilian shoreline and no survivors in sight, the Tichbornes steeled themselves for an unpleasant reality. With Roger gone, who would take care of the family? Worrying about her family's future, Lady Tichborne sought out a clairvoyant to try and figure out what she should do. But whatever she was hoping to get out of the psychic reading, we doubt that she expected to hear the clairvoyant say, "Your eldest son is alive and well." Now, while some would believe that the lady might have just been trying to comfort a grieving mother, the psychic's message came at a time when rumors had been swirling about the fact that some of the crew had been rescued by a passing ship. And now that a psychic had claimed that there were indeed survivors, people couldn't help but keep hope alive, especially Lady Tichborne. Refusing to sit still and grieve any longer, Lady Tichborne immediately sprung into action. She took to newspaper, advertising a handsome reward to anyone who knew anything about Roger's whereabouts or clues about his disappearance. She held nothing back due to the possibility of seeing her son alive, and not only described in great detail who Roger was and what he looked like, but also how he was the heir to his deceased father's vast estate. The news did cause quite a stir, but it would be a decade later before she uncovered any promising leads. In Wagga Wagga, Australia, a butcher named Thomas Castro had found himself in a bind. His debts were closing in on him and he was pressed for time and cash, so he made a desperate claim that he was a survivor of a shipwreck. Castro claimed he owned several properties in England but was unable to get to them, but it wasn't until he bought out a pipe with the initials RCT engraved into it that his lawyer made the connection between his client and the long-lost son of Lady Tichborne. Castro's lawyer pleaded with his client to come clean about being Roger Tichborne, but the butcher wouldn't budge. It was as if he didn't remember the shipwreck or his past life at all. But when the lawyer mentioned Lady Tichborne, everything changed. Almost as if someone had flicked a switch in his brain, Castro finally admitted that he was indeed the believed to be dead Roger Tichborne. And when Lady Tichborne heard the news, she immediately reached out to him, and it wasn't until Castro was en route to England. Now, when Roger Tichborne left for Jamaica, he was tall and lean while speaking with a French accent. Now he was squat, nearly 400 pounds, and spoke with a hybrid British-Australian accent. Differences raised a few eyebrows, but not Lady Tichborne's, who was desperate to see her son in the flesh, and as soon as she laid her eyes on him, she knew it was him. Since her other son Alfred had recently succumbed to alcoholism, finally finding Roger alive and well, even with his changes, was a relief, even if his story didn't make much sense. Castro/Roger claimed that he'd been rescued by a ship called the Osprey and had ended up in Australia, but he was now ready to resume life as the 11th Baronet of Tichborne, even though he'd spent the previous 10 years living as someone else for no discernible reason. Roger soon made arrangements to return to England permanently. He was a little strapped for cash, but his mother had no problem lending him some, and she also wasn't bothered about his insistence on creating a will, something he'd shown no interest in doing before. The will was written in the urging of the same lawyer who discovered him, but it was filled with odd details that some people couldn't help but question. For instance, the will contained notes about family properties that didn't exist, and Roger even referred to his mother as Hannah Frances, which was strange considering how his mother's name was Henrietta. But despite the oddities, Lady Tichborne, a few family friends, and even the family doctor all agreed the man standing before them was the real Roger. It helped that Roger was able to provide very specific details about Roger's childhood, such as his favorite fly fishing tackle and the name of his childhood dog. But mothers were still not entirely convinced. Besides not knowing his own mother's first name, which is reason for suspicion if we've ever heard one, Roger's letters were also filled with too many spelling and grammatical errors for such a well-educated man. There was also the fact that he could barely string together the simplest French phrases despite having been raised in Paris, and any memories of his boarding school days, which he once held dear, were all gone. For his part, Roger had a simple explanation for this. He explained the shipwreck had been so traumatic that his mind had never been the same, and it was the reason he couldn't remember several key details about his past, and it was also why he treated the people he once knew as strangers. Besides, his mother believed he was who he said he was, so why would anyone question a mother's intuition? However, this excuse was only viable for a few years before Roger's only real advocate, his mother, died in 1868. Now alone in the world and backed up against the wall, Roger Tichborne was forced to prove in court that he was truly the lost Baronet of Tichborne. As it turned out, the Roger Tichborne sitting in the courtroom trying to prove his identity wasn't as smart as the Roger Tichborne who departed on the Bella, and it didn't take long to identify him as someone other than Roger Tichborne or even Tom Castro. Instead, the investigators referred to him as Arthur Orton, the London-born son of a butcher who'd moved to Australia at one point and taken the name Tom Castro. When the man saw the news about Lady Tichborne's search for her son, he had an epiphany. Wasn't this an easy way to raise his social standing and clear his debts? Orton certainly thought so. He paid, or more likely promised to pay, 2 former Tichborne servants in exchange for specific information about the real Roger's life growing up. But even with all the proof brought forth, Roger refused to admit defeat. He claimed that he didn't know anyone by the name of Arthur Orton, but the court was able to compile more than 200 witnesses to prove his identity theft. However, this soon became unnecessary as a quick doctor's examination proved that the fake Roger didn't have the tattoos the real Roger possessed. The ensuing trial ended up being the longest ever in English court history, about 188 court days, and there was more than enough evidence to prove that Orton was lying from the start. The jury met for just 30 minutes before unanimously deciding Orton was guilty. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but even prison life didn't quench his thirst for notoriety. During that decade, he only admitted he was Arthur Orton once, and only because a journalist had paid him to do so. In fact, he continued to claim he was Roger Tichborne for the rest of his life, and though he died a poor man, the Tichborne placed a plaque on his coffin, forever identifying him as Sir Roger Charles Doughty Tichborne. For them, some semblance of closure was better than none at all.